Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and maybe your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Today's episode is called The Elf, where a sinister gift threatens to destroy a young man's sanity and his holiday spirit. I always loved Christmas when I was a kid. I loved the way everyone would be a little nicer, the house seemed a little warmer, smelled a little better. We had our traditions like the family snowball fight, caroling on Christmas Eve, and watching football on Christmas Day.
Defense, defense.
My older brother Jeff and I got along relatively well, even though he was only 5 years older than me. We didn't fight much, and he always looked out for me, which is why it was that much worse when he left home for college. I didn't mind so much that he was gone. What I minded was what he left behind, specifically the elf. Jeff had gotten this creepy-ass 2-foot-tall elf doll for Christmas from Jessica, a girl he was dating. I never knew much about her, except she was kind of goth-looking, always wearing dark, baggy clothing that made her look like a homeless person. And whenever she was at our house, I would catch her staring at me intently, her weird, light brown eyes fixated like she was waiting for me to start levitating or something. I remember the day Jessica gave him the doll. She showed up when Jeff wasn't there, which I'm sure was by design, and knocked her strange knock. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. I answered the door to see her standing there with a brightly wrapped box. She just stood there looking at me in fascination until I coughed uncomfortably and told her Jeff wasn't there. She shoved the package at me and said simply, "For, Jeff." Then she turned abruptly and walked away. I stared at her in confusion, and then the box shifted, as if something inside had moved. I suddenly didn't want to hold it anymore and ran to the living room and dropped the box next to the pile under the tree.
Plunk.
I kind of forgot about it until we were opening presents on Christmas Day and someone asked who it was for, since there wasn't a tag or anything on it. I pointed at it and said, "For, Jeff." The family watched as he opened it to reveal an elf dressed in jaunty red and green outfit, complete with a little stocking cap that had a tiny little bell on the tip. The doll had a round plastic face with realistic blue eyes mounted under slightly bunched eyebrows and red-tinted blushing cheeks. Bright white teeth were prominently displayed in an exaggerated grin, surrounded by a surprisingly scraggly reddish beard. Overall, it seemed its face was frozen in a perpetual sneer. Jeff looked at me in confusion, and I told him it was from Jessica. He shrugged and set it aside. My mom and dad made polite noises.
Oh, nice.
But I could tell they thought it was weird too. Jeff took the doll up to his room, and luckily I didn't see it again until he started college a few months later. The night after Jeff left, I was drifting off to sleep when I thought I heard a faint jingling sound.
Tingling.
It sounded like it was coming from far away, and I figured it was a bell on one of the neighbors' Christmas decorations. But then it started to get a little louder, and I realized it was coming from inside the house. Both my parents were already asleep. I could hear my dad's soft snoring. So I sat up in bed, cocking my head to figure out what the sound was. After a moment, I also began to hear a soft padding sound like footsteps.
Thump, 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 thump.
My bedroom door was closed, but I could see a faint light reflected off the polished floorboards of the hallway, most likely coming from the nightlight my mom kept plugged in the hallway outlet. As I watched, a small shadow crossed the light and stopped in front of my door. My heart started pounding as the door creaked in the frame. It was like something was pushing against it. Fear and curiosity were waging a war in my head, and curiosity won. I slowly swung my feet onto the floor and stood, eyes glued to the small shadows, I crept to the door. Just as I was reaching for the knob, I heard that tiny jingling sound again.
Ding-ling.
So I whipped open the door and stepped out. I looked up and down the hallway, but there was nothing there. I chalked it up to nerves, closed the door, and went back to bed. Over the next few weeks, I would occasionally hear the tiny jingle
Ding-ling.
as I drifted off, but each time I just told myself I was imagining it. As winter receded and warmer weather took hold, things seemed to get a little weirder. My mother complained that things would go missing from the cabinets, but she would always find them, but in odd places. For example, she once found a jar of olives perched on the shelf above the washing machine in the basement. Another time, a load of folded laundry was placed neatly in the oven. My parents began joking uneasily about a mischievous ghost, but they would look pointedly at me like they were expecting me to confess that I had done it. I never said anything, but I was pretty sure that it had something to do with that elf. Again, I tried not to think about it too much, rationalizing that whatever it was mostly harmless. Then, as the weather turned cold again and the holiday season began to ramp up, Jeff broke up with Jessica. Apparently, it was a very public, loud, and dramatic event. And I heard about it from several friends before Jeff himself told me during one of our weekly phone calls. He never gave me the details, but I knew it had been pretty nasty. I considered telling him about the weird stuff happening around the house, but I figured he had enough to deal with. During that week, it turned more sinister. Before, objects had just been moved around. Now, however, things were destroyed, and not just a random plate or glass, but things that had sentimental value, especially if they had anything to do with Jeff. His baby pictures were shredded on the kitchen floor. Several of his trophies were scattered in the street, and we didn't find them until several had been crushed by passing cars. Finally, his first baby rattle, a gift from my grandmother, was stuffed into the sink disposal, where it was destroyed when my mom turned it on. She cried for a few days after that.
Why?
I'd begun hearing the bell more regularly at night,
Ding-ling.
but had continued to ignore it. After the rattle incident, though, I knew I needed to do something. On the next trash day, I waited until my parents were gone and I went up to Jeff's room. The elf was perched on his bed, sitting almost straight up and staring at the door of it as if it had been waiting for me. I could have sworn Jeff had originally put the doll in a chair by his desk, but I shut that out of my mind and strode over to the bed and clamped an open trash bag over the doll's head, scooped it up, and cinched the trash bag in one smooth movement. I carried the bag out to the curb and tossed it in the trash bin, then waited and watched until the trash crew showed up a little while later, tossing all of our stuff into the giant green truck and rumbling away. I felt a sense of relief and went back inside. Late that night, however, I heard the tiny bell again.
Ding-ling.
Then the patter of soft thumps as something ran down the hallway.
Thump, 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 thump.
This time I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, yanking it open. As I looked down the hall, I glimpsed the door to my brother's room click close.
Click.
I walked down the hall and opened the door to Jeff's room, snapping on his overhead light.
Snick.
I froze when I saw the elf perched on the pillows just as I'd found him earlier in the day. But this time, it appeared to be looking straight ahead. I stared in disbelief. I'd thrown it away. I came in here and wrapped it up and tossed it in the trash. I'd had my eyes on it until the garbage man had thrown it in the truck. To make matters worse, I could even see splotches and stains on its garments. A mustard stain on its arm, coffee grounds on its leg, and some kind of string caught in its beard. I closed my eyes and was shaking my head to clear it when I heard a soft creak, accompanied by the tinkle of the tiny bell.
Ding-ling.
I opened my eyes to see the doll's head had turned to look at me. I gasped in horror and slammed the door,
Yeah. Slam.
then pounded down the hallway,
Dunk, 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 dunk.
slammed and locked my door,
Slam. Snick.
and then jumped into bed. I did restrain myself from pulling the covers over my head, but I spent the rest of the night staring at the space under my door. The next day, I didn't bother waiting until my parents were gone. I grabbed an old duffel bag from my closet and stomped into what I now considered the doll's room.
Stomp, stomp, stomp.
It was in the same position as before, staring at me as I crossed the room. I half expected it to put up a fight or run away or something, but it just sat there as I threw my bag over it and scooped it up again. My parents had been looking at me funny ever since we found Jeff's rattle in the disposal, and I knew they thought I had something to do with the mischief and destruction. So, when my dad asked where I was going, I mumbled something about going to the store and left the house. I knew it would take too long to explain, and I doubted they'd believe me anyway. I slung the bag across my back and jumped on my bike, pedaling across town to an old quarry that served as a popular swimming hole. Along the way, I occasionally felt the bag writhe a little, but I ignored my revulsion and continued on until I came to a short wooded path which led to a stone outcropping that the quote-unquote big kids used as a diving platform. I knelt near their edge and unzipped the bag about halfway, and then grabbed several nearby large rocks, stuffing them forcefully into the opening, willing them to smash that stupid doll's face. Each time I shoved a rock into the bag, I could hear that little tinkling sound.
Tingling.
Once the bag was full of rocks, I zipped it up and drug it to the edge. I heard one final tinkle before I shoved it and watched it hit the surface of the water,
Sploosh.
then plummet quickly into the depths. On the way home, I decided I would tell Jeff about the doll. I figured he'd be a little more likely to believe me, no matter how crazy it sounded. I noticed my parents' car was gone when I got home, and I didn't have my keys, so I jogged up the front steps and breathed a sigh of relief when I found they'd left the door open.
Whew.
Just as I stepped inside, however, I heard that goddamn tinkling sound again.
Tingling.
I froze and looked around for the source of the noise. This time, I heard distinct thumping sounds from the patter of little feet,
Thump, 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 thump.
and then jumped at a loud bang from the top of the stairs.
Bang.
My breath caught in my throat as the banging continued and got louder. I looked up to see a gray, fist-sized stone bouncing down the stairs. It clattered to a stop at my feet,
Thunk.
and I could see it was one of the stones I'd shoved into the duffel bag with the doll at the quarry. It was still wet and even left a little trail of water droplets on the stairs and the floor. I heard the tinkling sound again and jerked my head up.
Tingling.
The elf was standing at the top of the stairs. Staring at me. It raised a tiny arm and pointed at me, and then swiftly turned, and I heard it running down the hallway, and then a door slammed.
Slam.
My mouth hung open in disbelief, and I slowly picked up the rock and opened the front door, backing out onto the porch, and I shut it behind me. After what felt like an eternity of trying to process what I'd just seen, I took out my phone and I called Jeff. Once he answered, I told him everything. The nighttime sounds, the destruction of the heirlooms, the possessed doll, the failed attempts to get rid of said elf, etc., etc. At least, that's what I tried to do. In reality, I just gasped and wheezed random words for a minute until Jeff cut me off. "What is wrong with you? What's going on? What's this about a possession?" I took a breath and started over, slower this time, and summed it up. "That stupid doll Jessica gave you is haunted, or cursed, or whatever. It's breaking your shit, and no matter what I do, it comes back. It always comes back." Rather than laugh or scoff, Jeff simply sighed and said, "Yeah." Wait. "Yeah? That's it?" He was acting like, "Jeff?" I said quietly. "Uh-huh," he responded just as quietly. "Did you know about this? Did you know this was going to happen?" "Well, not really, but kinda." I exploded in rage. "What the fuck, Jeff?" Now he was the one stammering. I knew she was into that stuff, but I didn't think she'd, actually go through with it." "Stuff? What stuff, Jeff? You mean summoning the fucking demons of hell to possess some creepy-ass doll that runs around the house scaring the shit out of me and breaking your goddamn baby toys? I caught a slight movement out of the corner of my eye and turned to see the elf slowly part the living room curtains and stare out at me. It bumped a tiny fist against the glass. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared, the curtain swaying gently in its wake. Jeff was stammering through another explanation, and I cut him off. Listen, dude, I don't know what's going on with you and Jessica and that stupid doll, but fix it. My heart was hammering in my chest,
Boom, boom.
and I was feeling a little lightheaded with fear. I seriously can't handle much more of this, Jeff, and it'd probably give Mom and Dad a heart attack if they saw it, I added. Jeff promised to come up that night, but I ended the call while he was still talking. I stood on the porch, staring at the window where the little elf had been. I closed my eyes and tried to control my breathing,
Namaste.
and willed my heart to stop beating so hard. After a couple of minutes, I felt a little more composed and decided to go into the house, up to my room, and lock the door until Jeff arrived. I twisted the knob and pushed, but the front door wouldn't budge. The little bastard had locked me out of the house. Fuck! For the next hour or so, I sat on the porch steps, holding the rock in my hand and gazing at the living room windows. There were a couple times when I caught a furtive movement through the windows and saw the curtains shifting as if the doll was checking on me. By the time my parents arrived, my fear had mostly drained away to leave a seething anger. Mom and Dad's questions bounced off me again
Boing.
as I waited for them to unlock the door. Once it was open, I pushed past them with every intention of going into my room, getting my baseball bat, and smashing that stupid elf's head in. But I only got as far as the foyer when I stopped in astonishment. That damn elf had obviously run amok after locking me out.
Amok, amok, amok.
All the framed art and family pictures hanging on the wall had been turned upside down. An enormous mound of clothes, blankets, and towels had been piled on top of the dining table and doused with bleach. And there was an acrid burning smell coming from the living room fireplace, where it looked like several wrapped presents had been set on fire. From somewhere upstairs, heavy metal music was blasting. My parents started babbling at me,
Wah, 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 wah.
and I was surprised to see the accusatory glint in their eyes as they peppered me with more questions. I could see they actually thought I'd done all this. So I put my hands up and I said, "This wasn't me, I swear." Then, with no hesitation or guilt whatsoever, I threw Jeff under the bus. Jeff is on his way home. He can explain everything. Then I sprinted up the stairs to my room. I was shocked to find that nothing in my room was disturbed, except the loud music was coming from the radio by my bed. Everything else was where I'd left it. The ceiling fan turning lazily overhead, clothes hanging in the closet, books on the shelves, papers still stacked neatly on my desk. I stepped gingerly into the room, darting my eyes around, expecting the little elf to jump out at me from a corner. After a few steps, nothing had happened, so I crossed quickly and grabbed the bat from its spot between my bed and the night table. Then I turned off the radio.
Click.
As I did, I nudged my bed a little bit and it creaked, and then leaned away from me. I yelped and jumped back as it completely collapsed with a loud clatter.
Clatter.
Then my nightstand did the same thing. The fronts of all the drawers popped off and fell onto the floor with a bang,
Bang.
before the sides leaned into each other and the top, which held my clock radio and a lamp, pitched sideways with everything crumbling into a pile. The shelves suddenly dropped off the walls, spraying books, figurines, and other items across the floor as they slammed into the floor in a heap.
Slam.
My dresser suddenly leaned ominously towards me, and I leaped out of the way as it pitched forward and added the contents of my drawers to the growing pile of debris that had become my room. I looked up at a creaking sound and saw that my ceiling fan was now spinning insanely fast and wobbling crazily. A fan blade shot off and caught me squarely in the forehead.
Doink.
I staggered back, holding a hand to my head, and twisted out of the way as the remaining blades whipped around the room, slamming into the walls.
Dunk, dunk, dunk.
One hurtled into the mirror that was miraculously upright after the dresser's disintegration, shattering it and raining reflective glass all over the room. Last of all, the glass globe from the ceiling fan dropped straight down and shattered like a bomb. Tiny metallic shards sprayed everywhere, and I looked down as some of them bounced off my shoe. My eyes narrowed as I realized what they were. Screws and bolts, hundreds of them. The little bastard had removed every single screw, bolt, and nail that held my furniture together. My rage resurfaced in a rush. I stormed into the hallway and almost ran over my parents, who'd come up the stairs when they'd heard the commotion. My mother uttered a little shriek of fear at my crazed expression, and my dad stepped protectively in front of her, alternating his concerned gaze between my face and the bat I was brandishing. I wanted to put them at ease and explain how the haunted doll had been stalking the hallways of our house, terrorizing me and destroying our things, but I was just so angry all I could do was growl, "I'm going to get that elf," as I tore down the hallway to Jeff's room. I threw open the door hard enough to bounce off the wall and slammed back in my face.
Boink, slam.
I threw it open again and stepped into the room. The doll was sitting in a chair by the desk, staring at me. I took another step towards it, cocked my hips, and swung the bat in a flat arc that caught the elf squarely on the side of the head with a loud "fuck,"
Fuck.
and it flew across the room, smashing into the wall and crumpling to a heap on the floor.
Smash. Plop.
I heard my parents at the door pleading and begging for some explanation to this madness, but I was beyond caring. I ran over to the doll and began beating on it.
Die, die, die.
I hammered on it until my arms started to get tired and I was out of breath. Then I stepped back to survey my handiwork. The doll was nothing more than a pile of red and green rags, pieces of plastic, and wisps of stuffing. I smiled in satisfaction and turned to see my parents still standing in the doorway. My mother covered her mouth in horror, and my father's eyes were round with shock. This isn't what it looks like, guys," I said. Well, actually, it probably was exactly what it looked like. I tried again. Well, see, the elf had it coming because it was possessed or something, and I realized there really wasn't much I could say that would make any sense at this point, so I just shrugged and repeated, "Jeff will be home soon. He can explain." I started to walk out and then remembered the quarry, so I turned and snatched the pillow from Jeff's bed, pulled off the pillowcase, and quickly shoved the doll's remains into it. I slung it over my shoulder casually and edged past my parents, giving them a weak grin. Both of them stepped back warily. I made it about halfway down the stairs when I had a thought. I turned to my dad and said as casually as I could, "Hey, Dad, so, where do you keep the kerosene?" A couple hours later, Jeff joined me in the backyard where I was poking the embers in the fire pit where I burned the elf's remains to ash. Now that the elf was gone, I felt good, almost giddy even. So when Jeff approached me, I chuckled and punched him lightly on the shoulder to show I bore no ill feelings towards him, but I must have punched him harder than I thought because he winced and staggered backwards. He looked at me cautiously like Mom and Dad had been doing all day. You okay there, bud?" he asked. "Well, I took care of the problem, if that's what you mean, Jeff. No thanks to you." I turned back to the embers, squinted suspiciously at an errant piece of plastic, and picked up the kerosene. I heard Jeff protest, but I said, "Don't worry, man. I got this," as I tossed another healthy splash of the flammable liquid on the embers, which made a satisfying whoomp as a small fireball erupted upwards. I felt the heat flash on my face as it had been doing since I started burning the doll a couple hours ago. I reached up to scratch my forehead, and my eyebrows flaked away in my hand. Apparently, I'd singed them off while I was taking care of Jeff's problem, but no biggie. At least the goddamn doll was gone. I smiled cheerfully and looked back at Jeff, who came over and put his arm around my shoulder, gently steering me away from the fire pit. "Hey, bud," he said gently. Let's go inside and see if we can get you cleaned up." "What? No, I'm fine, Jeff, see?" I held up my hands to show how fine I was, but then saw that my clothes were blackened and soot-stained, and there were even a few places where embers had eaten holes into my shirt. I became aware of a pretty strong burnt hair smell wafting off of me. I said in surprise, and then I passed out. I awoke to my mother leaning over me, dabbing at my face with a washcloth. Considering how black the rag was, my face must have been filthy. I sat up groggily. I was still lying on the back porch and could see Jeff was over by the fire pit, shoveling the ashes into a plastic bag. As I watched, he dumped an entire package of salt into the bag and cinched it tight. He then walked over to us, holding the bag away from him like it was tainted. I didn't blame him. I sat up more and he cleared his throat as he put the bag down and sat on the steps. My mother stopped wiping my face and rose to her feet. She then gave us her patented mom glare, which is that unique way only mothers have of looking at their kids to let them know they are, in fact, in very big trouble. I coughed and stared at my blackened shoes, and Jeff cleared his throat again. "Explain," she demanded. I looked at Jeff and said, "Yeah, Jeff, explain." He looked embarrassed, which suited me just fine, and began to talk about how he and Jessica had messed around with occult stuff and experimented with different rituals. My mother stiffened at the mention of occult, and I cried out, "What the fuck, Jeff?" He nodded and held up his hands. I know, it was stupid, and I broke it off before it went too far." I jumped up and leaned over him, clenching my fists in fury. "Too far? Too far? A possessed elf doll dismantled my room like a goddamn IKEA exhibit." My mother intervened before I could start punching him. She put a soothing arm around my shoulders and looked down at Jeff, who hung his head in shame and embarrassment. "Jeff, honey," he looked up. "Get rid of the fucking doll," she said. Jeff told me later that burning the doll wouldn't have done anything, but luckily the disassembly by baseball bat coupled with the salt should keep it from coming back. I don't know what he did with it, and I really don't want to know. We did eventually get my room put back together. I made Jeff do it, and our house reorganized in time for Christmas. I was finally able to rekindle some of my old holiday joy. We had our snowball fight and went caroling and watched football, and everything was back to normal, except every once in a while, late at night, I still bolt upright in my bed, gasping for breath and looking nervously around my room. I never see anything, just innocent shapes and mundane shadows. But if I cock my head and listen, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of a tiny, tinkling bell.
Ding, ding.
The end.
The end.
Okay, so I guess that was our take on a Christmas story, right?
Yeah, so, Dark, where did your motivation for the story come from?
I don't know. I was just thinking about how creepy dolls are.
Dolls are creepy.
I don't think I've ever seen a doll after I was like maybe 5 years old that didn't just creep me out.
Especially those stupid elf on a shelf dolls.
Yeah, those are a little terrifying, actually. So I figured that may as well just harness some of the fear energy from the elf on a shelf and channel it into a story. How about that?
Worked for me.
On a happier note, what's the worst present you ever got in your life?
Worst present I ever got in my life? Well, Dark. The worst present I ever got in my life was from my ex-husband, and it was a bottle of contact solution that I had purchased for myself that he took off the shelf and wrapped up and gave to me for Christmas.
I didn't realize that was an option.
That's not an option.
No.
Don't even think about it. What about you? What was the worst present you ever got for Christmas?
probably the worst gift that I got. I got a pair of sweatpants that my grandmother had bought for herself, but they didn't really fit her. So she gave them to me.
What color were they?
Well, I mean, luckily they weren't like super feminine. They were like navy blue, and they had like a white stripe, white and yellow and pink stripe on the side.
Pink?
I think there was pink in there. I mean, overall, it wasn't like terribly emasculating, but I don't know. I wore the sweatpants for a while, but that was probably one of the worst.
Well, okay.
So, all right. So, with that, we appreciate you tuning in. Hope everyone has a great holiday season.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Yeah. Merry Christmas. Enjoy your New Year's.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, that. Happy New Year's. Until next time, I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed listening to our story as much as we enjoyed telling it. We're pretty sure you have more friends than we do, so be sure to tell them all about us and click to follow our podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at dark.n.precious or follow us on Facebook at Dark&Precious Storytime. Feel free to leave us any feedback or if you have any story suggestions. Who knows? You might just hear your story idea come to life in the next episode of Dark&Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.